Millionaire gave his smallest inheritance plot to his poorest son. 11 months later, he was shocked. Richard Thompson stood in the mahogany-lined library of his mansion, observing his 3 children seated in leather armchairs. The decision he was about to make would forever change the family dynamics he had built over decades in the construction industry. "You know why I called you here today," said the businessman, adjusting his glasses. "The time has come to divide what I've built throughout my life." Michael, the eldest son at 35, straightened in his chair. He had always been the favorite, a business graduate who had worked in his father's company since he was 22. Beside him, Jennifer, the youngest at 28, nervously twisted the diamond ring she'd received for her birthday. Between them, Brian, 32, remained silent, as he had ever since his stepmother Catherine entered the family 15 years earlier. "Michael, you'll take the main construction company and the downtown properties," Richard announced. "Jennifer, the 2 beach houses and the penthouse are yours." Catherine smiled faintly from the sofa where she watched everything unfold. It was exactly what she had suggested to her husband during months of whispered conversations in their bedroom. "And Brian," Richard paused dramatically, "for you, my son, I've set aside a special plot on the west side, 12,000 square feet. Brian lifted his head, surprised. 12,000 square feet sounded like a generous property, perhaps even larger than the others' inheritances. "Dad, that's very generous," he began, but Richard raised his hand. "I'm not finished. The land is in the Hope Springs neighborhood near the river. It was purchased 20 years ago and, well, it has its peculiarities." Michael and Jennifer exchanged glances. They knew the area, one of the poorest in the city, where the construction company had never managed to develop any projects. "What kind of peculiarities, Dad?" Brian asked. "It floods during the rainy season. There are pending documentation issues with the city, and let's just say the soil needs some special attention." Richard looked away. "But it's a good opportunity for you to prove what you're capable of." Silence filled the library. Brian felt the weight of his siblings' and stepmother's stares. He had always known he was different in the family. After losing his mother at just 10 years old, he had never received the same affection Richard showed the others. "I accept," Brian said simply. Catherine couldn't hide her satisfied smile. For years, she had subtly worked to push her stepson away, planting doubts about his competence and whispering criticisms in her husband's ear. "Excellent," Richard clapped once. "The paperwork will be transferred next week." In the days that followed, Brian visited the plot for the first time. What he saw left him speechless. It was a vast stretch of land overgrown with tall weeds, dotted with stagnant puddles. The smell was overpowering, a mix of mud and something chemical he couldn't identify. Amanda, his wife of 6 years, was 7 months pregnant and had insisted on coming with him. When she stepped out of the car, her foot sank into a puddle and she nearly lost her balance. "Brian, how are we supposed to build our life here?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Our baby is due in 2 months, and we don't even have a proper place to live." They were renting a small 2-bedroom apartment, using all their savings to cover pregnancy expenses. Brian worked as a civil engineer at a small firm, earning far less than his siblings, who were deeply involved in their father's business. "We'll figure it out, love," he said, holding her close. "First, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing. The following week, Brian hired a company to conduct soil tests. The results left him devastated. The land had been used years earlier by a small paint factory that had improperly dumped chemical waste. The soil was contaminated and would require expensive, lengthy treatment to become habitable. When he shared the news with his siblings during a family lunch on Sunday, their reaction was exactly what he expected. "Welcome to the real world, little brother," said Michael, cutting into his steak. "Now you'll see what it's like to really work without all the advantages Dad always gave you." "Michael, don't be like that," Jennifer scolded, but Brian could tell she found the situation amusing too. "It's an important lesson," Catherine remarked, pouring herself more wine. "Sometimes we need hardship to appreciate what we have." Richard remained silent throughout the meal, but Brian noticed his father avoiding his gaze. There was something in his behavior Brian couldn't quite decipher. Over the next month, as he tried to resolve the land issue, Brian began researching the history of the area. He discovered that decades ago, it had been a rural stretch where simple families tended gardens and raised small livestock. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he made the discovery that would change everything. Digging near the back of the property to better understand the drainage system, his shovel hit something solid. It was a rusted metal box buried about half a meter deep. Inside, protected by plastic, were documents yellowed with age. He took everything home and spent the night examining the papers with Amanda. They were old deeds, contracts, and even some black and white photographs of families working the land. "Look at this, Brian," Amanda said, pointing to a document. "This land was forcibly taken from the Martinez family in 1987. It says here they never received full compensation." Brian examined more documents. The story was heartbreaking and infuriating. 5 families had been evicted from their properties to make way for an industrialization project that never materialized. They were paid a pittance and forced to relocate to distant neighborhoods. "I need to find these people," Brian said. After 2 weeks of searching, he managed to locate some of the families. The first he visited was Mr. Frank Martinez, a 68-year-old man living in a modest home 10 kilometers from the property. "My father lost everything on that land," Frank told him, offering freshly brewed coffee. "He grew vegetables, sold them at the downtown market. We were poor, but we had dignity." "What happened after you left?" Brian asked. "My father never recovered. He tried starting over somewhere else, but he was already old. He spent his last years bitter, saying that one day someone would make things right." Brian felt a weight in his chest. Looking at this humble man, he saw the pain still fresh in his eyes. "Mr. Martinez, I have a proposal," Brian said. "How would you feel about going back to that land, together?" The older man eyed him skeptically. "What do you mean, son?" "I want to develop that property, but not alone. I want to do something that honors your father's memory and the other families who lost their homes." Brian explained his idea: cleaning the land, treating it properly, and creating a project to benefit the local community. Part would be affordable housing for families like Frank's, part a community center and green spaces. "But that'll cost a lot of money," Frank said. "And where will you get it?" "I'll sell everything I have. And let's look for partners, people who believe in the project." When Brian came home and told Amanda about the conversation, she got worried. "Honey, our baby will be born in a few weeks. We don't have any savings. How can we risk everything on an idea like this?" "Amanda, I can't just ignore what I found out. Those families were wronged, and now I have a chance to make things right." They talked late into the night. Amanda, despite her fears, ended up agreeing with her husband. She had always admired his generosity and sense of justice. Richard found out about his son's plans through Catherine, who had overheard a phone call between Brian and one of Frank's brothers. "That boy has completely lost his mind," said Richard, pacing nervously around the office. "He's going to lose everything he has on this crazy idea." "I always knew he didn't have a head for business," commented Catherine. "Maybe it's best to let him learn on his own." But Richard couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something in that story that deeply troubled him, a distant memory trying to surface in his mind. Meanwhile, Brian began putting the project into action. He sold his car, took out a bank loan using the apartment as collateral, and looked for companies specializing in contaminated soil recovery. The estimate he received was frightening, nearly $200,000 just for the chemical contamination treatment. It was far more than he had or could get. It was Mr. Frank Martinez who suggested an alternative. "Son, my brother-in-law worked his whole life at a waste treatment company. He's retired now but still has connections. How about we talk to him?" Robert, Frank's brother-in-law, was a technical and straightforward man. He visited the site, did his own analysis, and proposed a more affordable solution. "The soil is contaminated, but it's not impossible to recover," he explained. "I can get a team of former colleagues who'll do the job for a third of the price if you buy the materials." Even so, it was a steep amount by Brian's standards, but he was determined. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The news of the project began spreading through Hope Springs. Other families who had been wronged decades ago came forward to hear the proposal. Soon, Brian had a group of 15 families interested in participating. "We don't have money to invest," said Mrs. Williams, a 71-year-old woman whose parents had also lost land in the area. "But we have arms to work." "And knowledge," added Mr. Wilson, the son of former farmers. "My father taught me everything about planting and irrigation." The idea was taking shape. It would be a community project where each family contributed what they could, whether labor, knowledge, or small sums of money. Michael heard about what was happening through a construction company client who lived near Hope Springs. "Your brother is causing quite a stir over on the west side," the man said. "He's gathered a bunch of poor folks and is promising free houses for everyone." That night, Michael called Brian. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he asked angrily. "You're making promises you can't keep and dragging the family name into it." "I'm not using any family name," Brian replied. "This is my personal project." "A personal project that's becoming the talk of the whole city. Dad is furious." The next day, Richard showed up at the site where Brian was working with Robert's team on removing the chemical waste. "We need to talk," said Richard, standing at the edge of the lot, avoiding stepping in the mud. "I'm busy, Dad. If you want to talk, you can do it right here." "Brian, stop this nonsense right now. Sell this land, take the money, and buy something decent for your family." "I'm not selling. I already have an interested buyer, a businessman who wants to build an industrial warehouse here. He's offering $150,000. Brian stopped what he was doing and looked straight at his father. "It's not for sale. You have a pregnant wife and will be a father in a few weeks. You need to be responsible." "I am being responsible. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something that truly matters." Richard stood for a few minutes watching the workers. There was something in his son's determination that reminded him of himself decades ago. "If you keep up with this crazy idea, don't expect any help from me," Richard said before leaving. 2 weeks later, Amanda went into labor. Brian was on the land when he got the call from the hospital. He arrived there covered in mud, wearing work clothes, but just in time to witness his son's birth. Little Ethan was born healthy, weighing 7 pounds. When Brian held the baby for the first time, he was sure he was doing the right thing. "Our son will grow up in a better world," he whispered to Amanda. "I'll make sure of it." But the difficulties were just beginning. With Ethan's birth, expenses increased significantly. Brian had to go back to working part-time at the engineering firm to supplement their income, splitting his time between the job and the land project. It was during this time that he received an unexpected visit. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit showed up on the land one Thursday afternoon. "Are you Brian Thompson?" the man asked. "My name is Charles Harrison. I'm a partner at an urban development firm. What can I do for you?" "I heard about your project here and came to make an offer. We're interested in buying this land for $300,000. Brian nearly choked. It was double what his father had offered. "It's not for sale," he replied automatically. "Don't be hasty, that's a substantial amount. You could buy an excellent home in any neighborhood in the city." "And what would you do with the land?" "A housing development. Affordable apartments following all environmental regulations." Brian was immediately suspicious. Affordable apartments wouldn't bring in enough to justify that price. "I need to think about it," Brian said. "Of course, but don't take too long. The offer has a deadline." That night, Brian shared the offer with Amanda. She was nursing Ethan when he got home. $300,000, Brian. That's a lot of money. We could secure Ethan's future. But what about the families counting on the project? What about Mr. Frank Martinez, Mrs. Williams, all the others? You can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, honey. Brian stayed up all night, watching his son sleep. By morning, he had made his decision. He called Charles Harrison and refused the offer. The man's reaction was stronger than expected. "You'll regret this decision," Charles said before hanging up. 2 days later, Brian discovered who was really behind the offer. Charles Harrison was partners with Michael in a real estate investment firm they had recently started. He confronted his brother over the phone. "How could you do something like this?" Brian asked, furious. "It's just business, Brian, nothing personal." You were willing to deceive me to get my land. I was trying to help you. That crazy project will ruin you financially. And you'd make a nice profit in the process." Michael didn't deny it. The conversation ended with the two brothers fighting for the first time in their lives. The family situation grew even tenser when Jennifer showed up on the land a few days later. Unlike the others, she genuinely wanted to understand what Brian was doing. "Can I walk with you?" she asked. Brian showed his sister all the progress they had made. The soil was already being treated, the first basic structures were being built, and a drainage system was being installed. "It's impressive," said Jennifer, "but it must be costing a fortune." "Every penny I have, and I'll still need much more. Brian, I need to tell you something. Dad is in serious financial trouble." Brian stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "He made risky investments in recent years, lost a lot of money on a project that went wrong out in the countryside. The main construction company is deep in debt." "Does Michael know about this?" "Michael is trying to take control of everything. He convinced Dad to sign some documents, transferring part of the shares to him." Brian felt a mix of anger and worry. He was starting to understand why his father had insisted so much on him selling the land. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're my brother, and because I think what you're doing here is beautiful." Jennifer stayed for a few minutes, watching the community volunteers helping with the construction. "You know what impresses me the most?" she said. "You're giving hope to these people. It's been a long time since I've seen anyone in our family do something like this." When Jennifer left, Brian felt that at least one person in the family was on his side. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The fourth month of the project brought new challenges. The city agencies started showing up with complex bureaucratic demands. An inspector arrived with a list of violations that needed to be corrected immediately. "You don't have a permit for mixed-use construction," said the official, "nor authorization for community activities in this zone." Brian knew he was being targeted. The demands were too technical and too specific to be coincidental. Mr. Frank, who had experience with city bureaucracy, helped Brian understand what was happening. "Someone is pressuring the city to make your project difficult," said the older man. "I've seen this happen before." "But who would do this? Who has an interest in seeing you fail?" The answer was obvious, but Brian didn't want to believe his own brother would go that far. The confirmation came through Robert, who had contacts at City Hall. "Your brother Michael was here last week," one of the employees told Robert. "Said you were building illegally and that it could cause environmental problems for the city." Brian confronted Michael personally, showing up at the construction company's office on a Friday morning. "Did you really try to sabotage my project at City Hall?" asked Brian, walking into the room unannounced. "I'm protecting the family's interests," replied Michael, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "Your amateur projects could lead to lawsuits that would affect all of us." "What family interests? You've been trying to undermine me from day one." "You're the one undermining yourself. Dad is thinking of cutting ties with you for good if you keep up this nonsense." "Then let him." Michael finally looked at his brother. "Be careful what you wish for, Brian. Without the family's support, you won't be able to keep this project going for long." Brian left the office more determined than ever. If his brothers wanted war, he was ready to fight. With the help of Mr. Frank and other community members, he managed to get all the documentation required by the city in order. It took another 2 months and money he didn't have, but he finally obtained all the necessary permits. During that time, Richard didn't visit the site or speak to Brian. The only communication between them happened through Jennifer, who served as the unofficial intermediary. It was Jennifer who brought the news that Richard was considering selling the family home to pay off the construction company's debts. "Michael convinced Dad it's the only solution," she told Brian during a visit to the property. "He wants to buy the house at a low price and resell it later." "And Dad will agree?" "He's desperate. The debts are too high." Brian grew thoughtful. The house where he'd grown up represented decades of family memories. It was where his mother had spent her final years. "Jennifer, I need to talk to Dad. He said he doesn't want to see you as long as you're still working on that project. Then I'll go to him." That afternoon, Brian showed up at the family mansion. Catherine tried to stop him from entering, but he walked right past her and went to the office where Richard was meeting with Michael and some lawyers. "I need to talk to you, Dad. In private." "There's nothing to discuss," Richard said without looking at his son. "It's about the house. Jennifer told me you want to sell it." Michael stood up from his chair. "That's none of your business, Brian." "Shut up, Michael. I'm talking to my father." Richard asked everyone to leave the room. For the first time in months, father and son were alone. "Dad, don't sell this house," Brian said. "I have a better offer." "What offer?" "Let me mortgage my land. Use the money to pay off your debts." Richard finally looked directly at his son. "Your land isn't worth even a third of what I owe." "Not today, but it'll be worth much more when the project is finished." "Brian, stop dreaming. That project will never work." "Why are you so sure of that?" Richard was silent for a moment. Brian sensed there was something his father wasn't saying. "Because I tried something similar on that same land 20 years ago, and I failed." The revelation took Brian completely by surprise. "What do you mean?" "I bought that land with the idea of creating a social project, affordable housing, recreational areas, everything you're trying to do now." Brian sat in a chair, trying to process the information. "What happened?" "Reality happened. The costs got too high. The bureaucracy was impossible, and I ended up giving up. That's why the land sat abandoned all these years." "But Dad, you had far more resources than I do. Why couldn't you make it work?" Richard stood and walked to the window overlooking the mansion's garden. "Because I didn't have what you have. What do I have? People who believe in you, a real cause, and most of all the courage to give up everything for what you believe is right." Brian watched his father for several minutes, trying to understand the melancholy in his voice. "Dad, help me finish what you started." "It's too late, Brian. I've already lost too much money and too much time on impossible dreams." "It's not too late. You can be a partner in the project, invest what you can, and share the profits when it succeeds." "What profits? You're giving away homes for free to half the city." "There will be profits. Part of the land will be set aside for local businesses and small shops. It'll be a complete, self-sustaining neighborhood." Richard shook his head. "Even if I wanted to, I don't have money to invest. The debts have taken everything." Brian left the mansion with a decision made. He wouldn't let his father lose the house where his mother had been happy. In the weeks that followed, he worked harder than ever before. Beyond his job and the project on the land, he took on extra consulting work for other companies. He slept only 4 hours a night. Amanda was worried about her husband's condition. "You'll get sick if you keep this up," she said, watching Brian come home at 2 in the morning yet again. "Just a few more months, love. I need to raise enough money to help my dad and finish the project." "And Ethan? He hardly sees you awake." Brian looked at his son, sleeping in the crib. The baby had already turned 4 months old and was growing quickly. "I'm doing this for him too, so he can grow up in a world where people help each other." In the 7th month of the project, something unexpected happened. A violent storm hit the city, causing floods in several neighborhoods. Hope Springs, which had always suffered from flooding, was protected this time. The drainage system Brian had built on the property worked perfectly, absorbing massive amounts of rainwater and safeguarding all the homes in the area. The news spread quickly. Local newspapers sent reporters to cover the story of the engineer who saved the neighborhood from flooding. "How did you know this would work?" a journalist asked Brian. "It wasn't a guess. It was technical knowledge combined with love for the community." The report aired on the evening news. Richard watched at home, impressed by his son's confidence in the interview. "Did you see that?" Catherine asked. "Your son is becoming famous with his crazy idea." Richard didn't answer. He was remembering a conversation he'd had with his late wife years earlier. She had always said Brian had a special heart, different from his siblings. The coverage brought unexpected consequences. Several companies and investors began reaching out to Brian, offering partnerships and funding. The first to approach was a businessman from Chicago who was interested in replicating the model in other cities. "Your project has national potential," the man said during a meeting. I can invest $2 million, but I need 50% ownership. It was a tempting offer, but Brian refused. I can't accept a deal that takes control of the project away from me. The families in the community are my priority partners. Other investors came forward with similar proposals. They all wanted a share of the profits, but few understood the community-driven philosophy Brian was trying to implement. It was Mr. Frank Martinez who brought the solution. Son, my nephew works at a microcredit company in Philadelphia. They fund social projects with low interest and special terms. The company was called Community Credit Union and focused on initiatives that helped underprivileged communities. After reviewing Brian's proposal, they offered a loan of $500,000 with a 10-year repayment term and subsidized interest. "This is exactly what we need," Brian told Amanda that night. "We can finish the entire first phase of the project and even help my father with his debts." But the happiness didn't last. The following week, Brian received a legal notice. Michael had filed a lawsuit, claiming the project was being built on inherited land that hadn't been fully settled. "He's challenging the legitimacy of Dad's donation," explained the lawyer Brian hired. "Technically, until the inheritance is officially processed, the land still belongs to the family estate." It was a low blow, and Brian knew Michael was using a legal loophole to sabotage him. But technically, his brother was right. The lawsuit halted all construction on the property. Brian had to let the workers go and stop all progress that had been made. "I can't believe your own brother would do this," Amanda said, watching Brian slump onto the couch at home. "Michael has always been like this, competitive to the extreme. And now, what do we do?" Brian was silent for a moment. "I'll talk to Dad. He's the only one who can fix this." But Richard refused to see his son. Through Jennifer, he sent word that he was tired of all this family drama. That was when Brian made a drastic decision. If he couldn't continue the project on the land, he'd take the family somewhere else. He went to Mr. Frank Martinez and proposed something unusual. "What if we bought another plot? Smaller, cheaper, but completely ours." "With what money, son?" "With the loan from Community Credit Union, and by selling everything I have." Brian sold his apartment, the remaining furniture, and even his wedding ring to get the necessary funds. Amanda fully supported him, even knowing they'd be left without a place to live. "We'll stay at my mother's house temporarily," she said. "It's small, but it'll do for the three of us." With the money gathered, they managed to buy a smaller plot in the same area, but fully legalized and without any issues. It was an 8,000 square foot lot, enough for the project they had in mind. The families in the community were moved when they heard the project would continue. "You gave up everything for us," said Mrs. Williams, tears in her eyes. "We'll never forget this." Construction on the new land began with renewed enthusiasm. This time, each family contributed not just with labor, but also with small amounts of money they could save. Mr. Wilson secured a special discount on materials through an old employer. Robert organized weekend work groups, where volunteers from other neighborhoods came to help with construction. In 3 months, the first houses were ready. They were simple but well designed, with 2 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and bathroom. Each family contributed $50 monthly until they paid off the full cost of the house. The community center was the second structure completed. It had a small library, a meeting hall, and 2 rooms for vocational training. Brian was realizing the dream he'd envisioned a year earlier, but he had paid a high price. He was estranged from his family, living in a borrowed house and working 16 hours a day. It was during the 8th month of the project that he received a call that would change everything. "Brian?" It was Jennifer's voice, clearly shaken. "I need to talk to you urgently." "What happened?" "It's about Dad. He's in the hospital." Brian felt his heart race. "What's wrong with him?" "He had a heart attack last night. He's in the ICU." Against all of Catherine's advice, Brian went straight to the hospital. He found Michael in the hallway, visibly nervous. "How is he?" Brian asked. "Stable, but it was serious," Michael replied, not looking at his brother. "The doctors said it was the stress of the last few weeks." Brian felt overwhelming guilt. He knew the family feud had contributed to his father's condition. "Can I see him?" "Only close family." "I am close family." Michael was about to argue, but Jennifer intervened. "Stop it, Michael, he's our brother." Brian entered the ICU room and saw his father hooked up to machines. Richard was conscious, but clearly weakened. "Hi, Dad," Brian said, approaching the bed. Richard turned his head and looked at his son. His eyes were different, softer than the last time they'd seen each other. "Brian." His voice was weak. "How's your project going?" "It's going well, Dad. We moved to another plot." "I'm sorry for what Michael did." Brian held his father's hand. "Don't worry about that now. Just focus on getting better." "There's something I need to tell you," Richard said, struggling to speak. "About the land I gave you." "What is it, Dad?" "It wasn't out of spite, it was because that's where I started, where I met your mother." Brian was stunned by the revelation. "What do you mean?" "My father had a small garden in that area. I helped him on weekends. That's where I met your mother. She lived in one of the houses that were torn down later." Tears welled in Richard's eyes. "I wanted you to do what I couldn't. Bring dignity back to that place." Brian squeezed his father's hand tighter. "Dad, I can still do this. The land is still mine, right?" "Technically, yes. Michael is using a legal loophole, but he won't be able to take the land from you. Then when you get out of the hospital, we'll visit the new project together." Richard gave a weak smile. "I'd love that." Brian spent the afternoon at the hospital. As he was leaving, he ran into Michael in the parking lot. "I need to talk to you," Michael said. "I'm listening." "I'm dropping the lawsuit over the land." Brian looked at him in surprise. "Why?" "Because I nearly killed our father with all this stress, and because maybe you were right about some things." It was the first time Michael had shown any remorse for his actions. "Michael, I want to make you an offer. Let's work together." "How do you mean?" "You have construction experience and contacts at City Hall. I have the social vision and community support. Together, we could do something really big." Michael thought for a moment. "And how would the split work?" "There wouldn't be a split. It'd be a family project, you, me, Jennifer, all of us working toward the same goal." For the first time in months, the two brothers spoke as adults, without hostility or competition. "I need to think about it," Michael said, "but I like the idea." Richard stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. During that time, the family dynamic began to shift. Michael dropped the lawsuit and even offered some leftover construction materials from his company. Jennifer became a constant presence at the new project, helping organize vocational courses at the community center. When Richard was discharged, his first request was to visit his son's project. They arrived on a Saturday morning. The contrast to the original land was striking. Where there had once been weeds and stagnant water, there was now a small, organized community. 15 families were already living in the finished homes. The community center was bustling, offering sewing, carpentry, and computer classes. A small community garden grew vegetables sold at a weekend market. "My God," Richard said, walking slowly along the well-kept dirt paths. "This is exactly what I imagined 20 years ago." Mr. Frank Martinez came to greet the visitor. "You must be Brian's father," the older man said. "Your son is an angel to our community." Richard spoke with several families, hearing stories of resilience and hope. Everyone had something positive to say about Brian and how the project had changed their lives. "Mrs. Williams opened a small bakery in the community center," Mr. Wilson shared. "Robert is teaching mechanics to local youth." When they reached the modest 2-bedroom house where Brian and his family were staying temporarily, Richard found Amanda caring for little Ethan, now 8 months old. "How do you manage living here?" Richard asked, looking around. "With a lot of love," Amanda replied, smiling, "and the certainty that we're building something bigger than ourselves." Richard held his grandson. Ethan grinned at his grandfather, babbling happily. "He'll grow up seeing all this," Richard said. "He'll learn it's possible to make a difference in the world." That afternoon, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. "Brian, I want to sell my share in the construction company and invest here with you." "Dad, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. I want to spend my remaining years doing something that truly matters." Michael, who had joined the visit, spoke up. "I want in too. We could expand the project, build similar neighborhoods around the city. Jennifer clapped her hands, moved. Finally, our family is united again. Catherine, who had remained quiet the whole time, finally spoke. Richard, are you sure about this? That's a lot of money to invest in an experiment. It's the best experiment of my life, Richard replied. I should have done this a long time ago. The following months were filled with hard work, but also immense fulfillment. With Richard's investment and Michael's technical support, the project grew exponentially. They managed to buy back the original land and start a second housing development there, this time with enough resources to properly treat the soil and build an even more complete complex. A year after the project began, Brian stood on the ground where it had all started. The flooded, abandoned lot had transformed into a small planned community. There were 200 houses built, a community medical center, a school, a daycare, and even a small theater where residents organized weekend performances. Amanda approached, carrying Ethan, who was already walking. "Look over there, Ethan," she said, pointing to where Richard and Michael were working together, overseeing a new construction. Grandpa and Daddy building the future. "Mama," Ethan said, stretching his little arms toward Brian. Brian lifted his son so he could see the full scope of the project. "One day, all of this will be yours, Ethan. Not for you to own, but for you to care for." Mr. Frank Martinez approached, now wearing the uniform of the community center's general coordinator. "Mr. Brian, a delegation from the capital has arrived to see the project. They want to replicate the idea in other cities across the state." "That's wonderful, Mr. Frank. The dream is growing." That afternoon, Brian received a call from Community Credit Union, informing him that the project had been selected as a national model for sustainable community development. "You'll receive an award in Washington, D.C. next month," the company representative said, "and special funding to expand the model to other regions." When he hung up, Brian stood for a few minutes, taking in everything they had built. It was hard to believe that just a year ago, he had stood in the same spot staring at nothing but weeds and stagnant water. Richard walked over, covered in cement, but wearing a smile Brian hadn't seen in years. "You know what your mother would say if she were alive to see this?" his father asked. "What?" "That you were always the special one in the family. I just took too long to see it." Brian hugged his father. After so many months of conflict and separation, working side by side with him was an indescribable feeling. "Dad, there's something I want to tell you." "What is it?" "Thank you for giving me the worst piece of land in the inheritance. It was the best gift I've ever received." Richard laughed, moved. "Your mother always said you'd turn stones into diamonds." She was right. By the end of the day, the whole family had gathered in the main house of the complex for dinner. It was a tradition they had started. Every Friday, Richard, Michael, Jennifer, Brian, Amanda, and Ethan ate together, planning the next steps for the project. "Next week we start construction on the commercial area," Michael said, checking his notes. 20 small storefronts for community members to start their businesses. "And the vocational construction course begins next month," Jennifer added. "We already have 40 young people enrolled." Richard listened with pride. The family was united, working toward a common goal, making a difference in hundreds of lives. "Ethan will grow up here," Amanda said, watching the baby crawl across the floor. "He'll learn from an early age that it's possible to build a better world. And we'll teach him that real value isn't in what you own, but in what you build with your own hands," Brian finished. That night, after everyone had left, Brian and Amanda stayed on the porch, watching the lights of the community's homes twinkle in the distance. "Do you regret anything?" asked Amanda. "What would I regret?" "Giving up the comfort we had before, the apartment, the car, the easier life." Brian looked at his wife and smiled. "Amanda, before I had things. Now I have purpose. I have a close-knit family, a community that respects me, and the certainty that I'm leaving the world a little better for our son." "And you have me," she said, nestling into his arm. "And I have you, who stood by me when everyone doubted, who believed in the project even when I wasn't sure myself." They stayed there in silence for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the community settling down for the night. Children playing, adults chatting on their doorsteps, TVs humming softly in the background. "Brian? I'm pregnant again." Brian turned to look at his wife, surprised. "Really? I found out this morning. Haven't told anyone yet." Brian kissed her, overcome with emotion. "Our second child will be born here, in this place we built together. And they'll grow up seeing that dreams are possible with determination and the right people by your side." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this inspiring story of perseverance and family unity. Do you believe Brian made the right choices in giving up everything for the project? Share your thoughts in the comments and your own experiences about family and life's purpose. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one.